Could you spot a crisis before it strikes your organization? I'm Edward Siegel, a leadership strategy senior contributor for Forbes.com and author of the best-selling and award-winning book, Crisis Ahead: 101 Ways to Prepare for and Bounce Back from Disasters, Scandals, and Other Emergencies. My guest today is Chris Rosacca, president of Rosacca Communications and author of The Power of B2B Social Media. In this episode, he discusses how government agencies and companies can spot a potential crisis and the dangers they'll face if they don't. Welcome to Crisis Ahead, Chris. I'm glad you could join me today.
Thank you, Edward. Glad to be here.
Why do you think companies and government agencies should be on the lookout for a crisis?
Well, there's a lot riding on it, particularly in this day and age where social media and the internet make the spread of information happen in seconds rather than in days or weeks. It's critical in this day and age to really be aware of what's being said, not only externally among your target audiences or stakeholders, but also within your organization as well.
Do you think some organizations are more or less likely to have a crisis? And if so, which ones, and why do you think that's the case?
Well, it's an interesting question. We were just having this discussion internally amongst our management team, and we've seen that crises occur with our nonprofit clients, with our NGOs, with NGOs that we've represented, with corporations, and with government entities as well. So it's really non-discriminate. It doesn't discriminate. Crises or a crisis will not discriminate and can tarnish your reputation and damage not only your reputation, but that can lead to certainly issues with employees and employee dissatisfaction. It can lead to the loss of contracts, government contracts, or others. So there are a whole host of reasons why, regardless of what kind of industry you're in or sector you're in, that you should pay real close attention to monitoring for crisis situations and proactively addressing them.
Well, can you give us a few examples of the early warning signs that would signal a crisis is on the horizon for an agency or company?
Sure. And the early warning signs really fall into several different categories, Edward. First and foremost, social media. Red flags on social platforms could include negative comments, and certainly you want to look at the volume of posts piggybacking on negative comments, negative hashtags with your organization's name in them, negative trends or comments on your pages or in your groups, because you may belong to certain groups, say on LinkedIn, and that can all be monitored. And again, you want to be mindful of a comment that is compounded with other negative comments, because those become really the leading posts on Twitter, for example. If there's a negative comment and another is added to that thread, that will be the top post, that negative post, even if there's additional information subsequently added to counter that information, say it's false information. And then, of course, you have to really look out for accounts that are created to attack your organization. Fake accounts are very common on social media. They can impersonate an organization. They can impersonate an individual. So social is one big area. And then another would be, comments from your customers and feedback from your employees. one of the things that we always say is, if you don't truly have an open door policy, you can really bury yourself, because if people don't feel comfortable coming to you and expressing an issue or their dissatisfaction, that will start the social media engine, that will start negative email exchanges. So you really need to have, people need to feel like they can vent, like they can communicate without being singled out or penalized for speaking up.
It almost sounds like
Um,
it's contagious, almost like a virus that it will spread from person to person or to post and make crisis that much worse. So, would you say that would be the case?
yes, and indeed, and the other thing is that if you don't address it in a timely fashion, and you don't address it with a level of empathy or understanding, you're setting yourself up for a landslide of negativity. And just as you were suggesting, it's a snowball effect. So you really want to not only listen to people, but then empathize and say, okay, here's their point of view, their perspective, and rather than having blinders on, right? So um, yeah, and then there's another way to kind of keep your finger on the pulse of your reputation, and a way to prevent crises is to also monitor mainstream news media as well. Certainly, there are free platforms that you can use like Talkwalker, and there are paid that you can also use for monitoring what's being said. But we always suggest using a multitude of tools. Use as many tools as you can possibly combine, because there's no one platform that can monitor all channels. So it's really important to use multiple tools. A lot of them are free, and social platforms. You can do listening manually and without buying expensive software. If you have, say, an intern or a team a team of interns that can monitor on your behalf, we certainly suggest that.
But that sounds like it'd become a full time job for a staff person, an intern, or a corporate official. How do you keep this in perspective so that monitoring does not become your full time job and you're able to do whatever else you're supposed to be doing at the organization?
Right, and that we for that we have found that combining free tools with paid services, particularly with social monitoring, um, that pays off in the end run. So you may find a social listening tool that can monitor all but, say, one or two platforms, and that would then save your team's time monitoring, you know, uh, doing them individually, each platform. And then when it comes to monitoring traditional media, using a combination of tools, Talkwalker, Google Alerts, if you have Cision or one of the other, Meltwater, or one of the other platforms that you already have, many of those have listening, news listening or news monitoring uh, components. Then you're widening the net, and you're more likely to catch things from being said. And that's not going to be a heavy lift, because you can monitor once daily. You don't have to do it every hour on the hour. And you can use the paid tool, say for social listening, to monitor at a frequency that you'd like, that you can schedule it as often as you'd like in most cases.
And what about events or current developments in the news? So late breaking news that happens that could affect your industry, your profession, or your business directly. What's the best way to keep on top of those developing situations?
Well, there are certainly we monitor for legislation. We monitor for legal action like lawsuits. With some clients, we're monitoring for recalls, product recalls. In most instances, if you're monitoring for your own name, of course, it's going to be easy to monitor for key industry key phrases. So your industry's key phrases, again, might include some of the things that I mentioned. The other thing that you'll find is that in many trade publications, and we work extensively with nonprofit, education, and healthcare clients. So we're reading those trade publications regularly, from the Chronicle of Philanthropy to the Chronicle of Higher Education, right? So you'll see trends identified in those publications, and we read them online. We monitor those publications online. We're able to identify trends that are very, very high profile. So, for instance, in education, our education clients, and we have a number of them, right now they're faced with AI and the role AI is going to be playing in education, right? That's actually taken a turn, and a lot of negative stories have run in not only the trades, but of course in mainstream media about AI. So we want to know what's being said. And then of course, that creates an opportunity for our clients if we flag to them and say, hey, there's an opportunity to talk about the positive aspects of AI and how that can not help students cheat, but help teachers do mundane tasks so they can in turn help students individually and spend more time with students, working with them. Then you're now adding a value to the organization by identifying an opportunity that, again, emerged from something negative that's been written about.
What about Google Alerts? I know a lot of people turn to that as one of the free tools to use to monitor for the keywords. How does that stack up against the other tools you've mentioned?
So we find that when combining tools, you're a lot more likely to flag them, to catch them. We've had Google Alerts miss very important stories that our clients really needed to hear about. They needed to identify the issue that the Google Alert missed altogether. So when we do our monitoring, we combine two free tools, TalkWalker Alerts, Google Alerts, and we combine that with our paid tools. In our case, we're using Cision for monitoring, but there are a number of different platforms out there. That's on the traditional news side. And then for social monitoring and listening, there are a number of tools, and they have their advantages and disadvantages. We've used 3 or 4, you have advantages and disadvantages to each platform. What I can say is that even some of the traditional news monitoring tools that are free will also catch social, but not with a high level of accuracy.
What policies and procedures do you think organizations should have in place to help ensure that they're monitoring for these early warning signs? Should they build this into their policies and procedures manual, bake it into the crisis management plan? What's the best way to make sure they're doing it the right things the right way at the right time?
Well, regardless of whether you're infusing policies and procedures to identify early warning signs of crisis situations that can impact your reputation, these policies need to be in place. So they don't have to necessarily be part of your crisis plan, but your social media team or your communications team or your public relations team, for instance, has to have policies and procedures that identify necessary action steps with social listening. And again, this is something that covers a part of it, but then your internal communications, that was the other piece that we discussed. And there need to be, I believe, human resource policies around, and this needs to start at the top. This needs to start with your C-suite, and your HR department needs to be supported by the C-suite to really ensure that people have that freedom, again, to express their concerns, so it does not create an email chain and it does not result in, as you said, that snowball effect, and that you're able to identify early on issues with the workforce, those internal issues that can make a huge impact on stakeholder perception and public perception of your organization. So one example is, whistleblowers, right? Whistleblowers historically have gotten a very bad rap. What are they doing? They're coming forth and they're telling the truth. And the perception of a whistleblower is not a good one. It's not a positive one. And frankly, they're not generally not supported in any way, shape, or form within an organization or publicly. So that needs to go away, and the stigma associated with that. And again, adapting and changing your policies to welcome comments that you might not want to hear about, that's a smart move.
From your perspective, are there any government agencies or businesses that you think are doing a good job monitoring for a possible crisis? And if so, can you name a few?
Sure. There are, I'll give you Procter, Tide pods. They had a situation, I'm not sure if you recall the Tide Pod Challenge, but yeah, and this is a consumer brand, and certainly I think a real good indication of how quickly an organization can and should act. There was a Tide Pod Challenge, and it turned out that teenagers were actually eating Tide Pods. And these are the pods that go in your laundry. That's no one suggested that kids eat these, right? I mean, this is really not a smart move. So they hired Rob Gronkowski, NFL superstar, as you know, from the Patriots, and he did a video. And he's tough, right? He's a tough. He says it like it is. He states it like it is. He's tough, no dilly-dallying around, and he got tough in his messaging and said, "No, who said it was okay to eat these things?" And it was done in a way that demonstrated that this organization is monitoring and very quickly addressing, in this case, a potential public health disaster. Right? If a large enough number of kids consume them, it would be disastrous. There would be a lot of hospital visits, right? So that's one example. And then, another is the Starbucks racism case that happened a couple of years ago. Starbucks closed 8,000 stores for racial bias training after that occurred. And if that doesn't demonstrate they're taking this serious, then nothing would, because closing 8,000 stores is a that's a big statement right there. Huge statement. So I think that, a lot of the consumer brands are doing this. But again, in the world of business to business, I think there's room for improvement. I think there's room for improvement in education, even in healthcare, as well as in the nonprofit world, because you want to understand sentiment. You want to understand what people are saying. So I think certain sectors are behind. Consumer products know that it's important, but I think certain sectors really need to step up and do a better job of monitoring and quickly responding to crises.
Well, you mentioned companies and organizations that appear to have done a good job in being proactive, but what can we learn from companies or even government agencies that fail to heed the warning signs and they're essentially in a state of denial for a crisis? Can you name some companies that might fall into that category?
Sure. Well, there have been, there are a number of organizations that either have not, listened or not treated a situation as though it's important. And that did happen with Volkswagen, and they kind of turned it. They did turn it around, but initially, their misreporting of their of the situation in regard to pollution and controlling the output of toxic, highly toxic levels of exhaust. In the beginning, it was just radio silence, and they did come around and they finally did something. But there are also government organizations. I believe it was, and I don't want to state it wrong, but it had to do with the Department of Education. I know that, and in their correspondence, the Department of Education had multiple typos in public statements. There were multiple typos. Well, you're talking about the U.S. Department of Education and having typos in correspondence that went out to the masses. And obviously something like that can be embarrassing, right? But then what do you do? Well, they issued a second statement, and in that second statement, there was another typo. So you have to pay close attention to detail, and messaging is critical. Having a second or third or fourth set of eyes is critical. And having a team in many instances, that expertise is not available in-house. So you have to really look outside of the organization to get support. And we find that, many organizations find that is a combination of the two: an internal team, crisis team, obviously, and monitoring team, and having outside support and oversight. That's the winning combination right there, because you can't be divorced from it. You can't say, oh, well, we have a company that handles that, and you can't say, oh, we can handle all this ourselves, right? So it's a combination.
If company executives or even managers of government agencies have yet to take steps to be proactive in monitoring for early signs of a crisis, what are the first things you think they should now to help make sure they get on board and start doing the monitoring that they should have been doing?
It's important to identify the department within an organization that should be responsible for social listening, and that may differ from the department that is handling traditional news monitoring. But there's a danger there. If you have different areas within a company, say a social team, that might be part of marketing, or your content team, and then you have traditional media, which is public relations, community relations, etc., maybe even public affairs. what happens is, in many instances, those two teams are monitoring, but they're doing it in silos. So my recommendation is have one person be ultimately responsible for not only the monitoring in those different areas that I just mentioned, but sharing information among those teams. So you not only identify potential crises, but you can really see those issues that have the greatest potential to damage your organization's reputation.
To help break down those silos, do you recommend those team members that are on their own monitoring different monitoring tools? Do you think they should be part of the crisis response team?
It may not be the crisis response team, because it should be a level down from the crisis response team, because there has to be an individual, again, responsible for flagging potential crises before it even goes to determine whether this is a crisis or not, right? And again, this is something that has to happen very quickly. So I think that, having somebody responsible for monitoring across social, across traditional media, and connecting with human resources to flag those internal communications that can indicate a crisis. That person, it can't be a junior person, right? Or at least, not who's ultimately responsible, right? So that person then would take a seat on the crisis response team. That's how I recommend structuring it, Edward.
I'm afraid we're almost out of time, Chris, for today's interview. What do you think is the most important message you want people to remember from our conversation?
Monitor, monitor, monitor. Know what's being said about your organization from the inside out, and fuse human resources, your internal comms, and your social monitoring piece, as well as traditional news monitoring, into that, again, a cohesive monitoring protocol. And those procedures, again, should be under the responsibility of, we believe, from what we've seen, one individual. Of course, they can have their teams, but have that be the responsibility of one individual rather than multiple, because then there's real ownership and accountability to the crisis response team.
Good advice. Thanks again for being with me today, Chris. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Edward. I appreciate the opportunity, and I'm happy to have joined you today.
That's it for this edition of Crisis Ahead. My guest today was Chris Rosacca, author of The Power of B2B Social Media and president of Rosacca Communications. Be sure to come back next week for more advice and insights on preparing for, managing, and recovering from a crisis. Or subscribe to Crisis Ahead wherever you get podcasts. Remember, it's not a matter of if a crisis will hit your organization or company, it's when. And the sooner you're prepared for it, the better.
Produced by Heartcast Media.